A recent report on the extent of the destruction of the Earth's ozone layer stunned scientists and politicians alike. It found that a large ozone hole could open up over North America by the end of this winter. Legislators took action immediately, with the Senate unanimously passing a law to stop production of ozone-harming chemicals as early as 1996. But will this change come soon enough, and what will happen if an ozone hole does open here? Joining me now to talk about it are Dr. Michael Oppenheimer, Senior Scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund and a leading authority on global climate change, and science journalist Michael Lemonick, who wrote Time Magazine's cover story on the danger to the ozone level. We got to do some definitions here first. Tell me, Michael, I'll turn to you since I mentioned the Time Magazine first. I mean, what do we mean by the ozone, and what is the threat to it? Why is it important, and why does a hole open us up to pretend enormous threat to the life on the planet?
Okay, ozone is a form of oxygen, and there's a layer of it in the stratosphere. Very thin layer, but it's important because what it does is absorbs ultraviolet light that comes from the sun. And if this ultraviolet light got all the way to the surface, in fact some of it does, that's what causes sunburns, in fact, and some skin cancers. If a lot more of it gets to the surface, things like sunburns, skin cancers, cataracts get much worse. So it's a protective shield. The danger that happens if something tampers with this ozone layer is that we are all now going to get blasted by this form of radiation that causes these problems.
And how far along are we? I mean, is it, there are those who are saying that we should have seen this coming and should have done something about it, and that because we didn't, we got real problems.
Right, and that's may or may not be a fair statement. It's a true statement. I don't know if it's a fair statement. Yes, that's right. There were people who saw the problems coming with man-made chemicals, which attack this ozone layer, as far back as almost 20 years ago. Nobody really understood the extent of the problem back then, and so any kind of rapid and severe action might have been too much to hope for.
How much more serious is the alarm than was expected? Even though we've had these kinds of warnings, there were people who said this is a problem, we've got to do something about it. Senator Al Gore, Earth in the Balance, writes about the threat to the ozone layer. But we had, because of these NASA planes and some data that people said it made it much more significantly threatening than we imagined.
Well, you really have to go back to the first discovery of ozone depletion, which was the observation of the Antarctic ozone hole. Over Antarctica in the springtime, fully half the ozone layer disappears for a month or two. You have to compare that to what scientists thought was going to happen before that ozone hole was discovered. They were predicting that as of now there would only be about a 1 or 2% depletion of ozone. In fact, what happened, half the ozone layer is blown away over Antarctica for a couple of months every year, and right here over the United States we have 5 to 10% ozone losses every year. That's getting worse. The new findings suggest that something similar to the Antarctic ozone hole, but probably not quite as severe, could form over North America as a fairly regular phenomena. It depends in part on what sort of weather we get in the stratosphere every year. So we don't have models. Right now we're flying blind. The amount of ozone depletion is not predictable.
I read, maybe in Time Magazine, maybe in your piece, but somewhere, that if the ozone level drops 10%, there's some evidence that skin cancer goes up 26%.
Right. There's a nonlinear relationship between ozone depletion and skin cancer, so that you get 2 or 3 times the percentage of skin cancer, increase in the percentage of skin cancer, as you do the percentage of ozone depletion. 10% ozone depletion, something between 25 and 30% increase in skin cancer. What we're more worried about, however, are the things that we can't stick numbers on.
Like?
In addition to skin cancer, every living thing that walks, crawls, or grows on the surface of the planet is vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation. It's toxic to anything that lives. So trees, crops, phytoplankton that float on the surface of the ocean and are the base of the marine food chain, all of these things are going to be affected negatively.
You even see, jump in on this, you even see some, I think, people suggesting that it may threaten our immunity system. And go ahead.
There have been some studies done more in animals than in humans that show that exposure to ultraviolet light can increase susceptibility to infectious diseases.
Because it weakens the immunity system.
That's right. That's right. It weakens the immune system. And as Michael pointed out, the problem is that we just don't know. We don't know how much these effects are going to be. That is, we don't know how badly our immune systems might be affected. We don't know how badly crops might be affected.
Well, stop there. What's happening in Australia where there's some threat to the wheat supply? I mean, there's some threat to the food supply?
Again, there's no hard numbers. Australia, which is kind of within striking distance of the Antarctic ozone hole or the edges of it, seems to be some evidence that food crops, and I don't recall exactly what crops, I think wheat may be one of them, there seem to be reduced yields from what people had expected or from past years, and it's not clear, but there's certainly an argument that it's because of more ultraviolet light getting through.
What we do know, by the way, on that point is that in controlled experiments, most cereal grains are vulnerable to the extent that a 1% decrease in ozone would be expected to bring about a 1% decrease in yield. So if we're going to have these large ozone depletions of the order of 10% or more, we're looking at significant reductions in the availability of food in certain parts of the earth.
Speak to your own particular area of expertise, which is global climate change. We all have been warned in this book and other places by your organization about global warming and all of that. But what is the connection between global climate change and the ozone and holes in,
There are many connections, but I think the most important one is the lessons we should draw from ozone depletion, and we should transfer those lessons to global warming. Well, in both cases, we have gases. In the case of ozone depletion, chlorofluorocarbons. Right. In the case of global warming, primarily carbon dioxide, we are emitting gases which live a long time in the atmosphere. Once they're emitted,
some say up to 100 years in some cases.
Over 100 years in these cases. And once the gases are there, there's not a damn thing we can do to get them out of the atmosphere. So you have to make decisions about what's going to happen in the future, 100, 200 years in advance. That's the scale of the decisions we have in our hands today. And the trouble is that we don't see the effects of those emissions immediately. If you emit a chlorofluorocarbon molecule or carbon dioxide, the full effects of those things on the climate or ozone don't happen for decades.
Is it true, and I don't know where I got this, but only 6 years ago, the global ozone depletion had not even been detected? Detected, not in question, warned about, but detected.
I think that is true.
Yeah.
The first
6 years ago.
The first ozone depletion measured was 85, but it was only over Antarctica.
Yeah.
And that's 7 years ago now. And globally, we haven't had a sense that the global ozone layer was deteriorated until 1988. And the full effects are only starting to be visible now.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that it's a terrible problem trying to get political action in a place where politicians want to make people feel good about the next 6 months, to get action on something that's a 100-year problem.
Well, in the most recent Democratic debate, Senator Kerry said something. There are only two people who don't believe. I mean, he suggested that President Bush did not accept this, although I'm sure the president would, and his advisors, Riley and others, would suggest that he did. But what action should Washington be taking? Kinds of things.
Well, on chlorofluorocarbons and ozone, there is a treaty that many nations have signed, including us, which eventually would guarantee the elimination of those chemicals. What we have to do now is speed the deadlines in that treaty to make it happen faster, because that can make a big difference in the ultimate level of skin cancer.
You mean like to 1996 or something?
1994 is what our organization has asked for. We've got to include more chemicals, because in addition to the major chlorofluorocarbons, there are other minor depleters that become important down the line. But most important, as I started to say before, there's a lesson in this for global warming. The lesson is, even in spite of scientific uncertainty, don't take a risk. We only have one planet. We shouldn't be experimenting on it. Act in advance. Act before the damage happens.
You know that there's still some people that come along and say, look, the Earth will adjust. It'll take care of itself. It will develop its own resistance to this.
That's true, and it's a lousy argument. And the reason is that the Earth has gone through in its past many episodes of climate change, ozone loss, terrible ultraviolet bombardment, And yes, life adapted. 75% of all species might have died off at the time, enabling new species to come forward. But yes, the Earth adapted. So the thing is, if we're willing to risk wiping out enormous numbers of species, including perhaps ourselves, the Earth itself will be fine.
The bacteria will adapt.
The
whether we
cockroaches
will or
be
not
fine.
is an entirely different question.
Lay out the worst. I mean, it scares us to death.
The worst case scenario, if ozone depletion progresses to a degree that we cannot yet
At the
predict,
level it has been progressing.
if that keeps happening, and I will add, let's talk about global warming too.
All right.
If that problem gets out of control, we're looking at a future which much higher levels of ultraviolet radiation, which are causing biological systems to crash. This is contributing. Itself contributes to the warming of the Earth, rising sea levels, social dislocation because of decreases in food productivity, and basically all hell breaking loose in the middle of the 21st century. That's a future we can't avoid. We have to act now if we're going to avoid it.
And are other countries doing more than we're doing?
On ozone,
Or is it because we contribute so much more, in certain terms of global warming, because of CO2 that we put in from automobile emissions, and maybe we use more of these products that send up the chloro...
On ozone depletion, all the countries of the world, with the exception of India, which is an important exception, we're going to have to bring them along, have agreed to eliminate the chemicals. I think that will now be done in a timely fashion. But on global warming, there's a negotiation going on at the UN this week to reach a treaty to limit the emissions of these chemicals. The U.S. is the only industrial country that has not agreed to participate in developing limits to limit the emissions of carbon dioxide. If the U.S. doesn't agree, the agreement falls apart, and then it's not clear what our future will be. President Bush has got to show leadership on this.
Any reaction to the piece? I mean, this is a cover story of Time magazine in the midst of a political campaign.
Any reaction from political?
From people. I mean, is it...
Well, I'm not prepared to say that the Bush administration's decision to finally go ahead and call for faster phase-out is due to our cover story. I can't say that.
Yeah.
I imagine they get time in the White House. I think it's not necessarily a reaction to this piece. It's a reaction to the discovery that we were writing about, the discovery that there may be now a hole over the northern hemisphere.
But it's coming from the government. They're the people that are finding the hole.
Well, yes, that's right. But these are the scientists in the government, not the politicians who are finding the hole.
It's odd that this administration has a pattern of not believing its own scientists until what's happened is manifestly obvious to everyone. They tend to say, well, you guys are always arguing the sky is falling.
You environmentalists.
You environmentalists are crazy. Yeah. You're saying the sky is falling. Well, the sky is falling in this case.
Al Gore writes about this in this book, Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit, book that's gotten a lot of very good reviews. I want to close. I'm over time, but it is the ozone depletion. It is global warming. There's one other serious and major environmental threat that's in that category. What is it?
I think he's talking about loss of biological diversity. Okay. That is a narrowing of the number of species on Earth. Earth won't be much of a place to live if we knock out most of the trees.
The balance is gone.
If we knock out most of the animals, the balance is gone. We can probably survive, but we might wind up living in plastic bubbles or something like that. We don't want that to happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure. We'll be right back. Stay with us.